Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, colleagues, to everyone who's joining us for this important session towards the end of the closing of the Stockholm Forum this year in its virtual format. We're really pleased that you can all join us. I think we have, the numbers are ticking up, so we have almost 70 colleagues on the line now with us. Again, a warm welcome to you. I hope you're all healthy and safe. Very pleased to have a distinguished panel with us of a number of our good colleagues and partners in a number of areas working on prevention and peace building. Maybe I'll start with a couple of quick organizational issues. One, please remember that this is a recorded session, will be available on the Stockholm Forum website. So just be mindful of that as you either comment in the chat or if we open it up. But obviously, you're welcome to, I mean, you know that. Secondly, we are making the option open to everyone to see the chat box. Because in the truncated version and in 1 hour, we may be able to interact all together verbally, but at the same time, we want colleagues to interact together on the chat, raising questions, comments, and having that kind of exchange. We will spend about the first maybe 25 minutes going through the presentations and opening remarks from the colleagues. And then after that, we will open it up in the chat, as well as maybe opening up to verbal exchanges if we can for maybe another 20 minutes. I know it's going to be tough, but I think that's a preferred method. And then the last 10 minutes will be for the speakers to recap, either respond to some of the questions that appeared in other presentations or some of the comments as well. So just please note the chat function. It's super useful. Just a couple of quick opening remarks on my part, and then we go directly to the presenters. One is, a lot of the colleagues will know this, conflict prevention and peace building has been and continues to be at center stage. Certainly since 2016 with the twin peace building and sustaining peace resolutions, ongoing peace building architecture review. A number of you are engaged in this. We're expecting another report of the Secretary General on peace building and sustaining peace this year as well. And it's 15 years since the peace building architecture is there. So an important moment for review. On the SDGs front, we have 10 years to go. In conflict fragile peace settings, I think it is important to try to figure out how much of an impact have we made collectively, which is a good topic, I think, for this particular session, and how we're measuring that as well. So I think contextually and in terms of the big frameworks, there's plenty, I think, that enables this session to be timely and to move ahead as well. All of us together have been engaged in a lot of interventions. Almost everyone on the line, certainly the presenters, are personally and institutionally invested for over a decade, maybe even more, as individuals, as networks of networks. Everyone has been thinking about the impact, the measurement, the relationship of quantity to quality, a lot of interventions, but what is the quality and sustainability of those? The relationship of doing this at an international policy global stage, and how that fits with national and local initiatives and peace holders. These are the kinds of questions that we will be thinking about as well. As you see from the panel already, the discussions will indeed be about quality and quantity as well. What data do we have to look at to measure the work on prevention from an early warning and supporting decision-making perspectives, and then on the impact of peace building as well. I won't go too much into the work that we do in UNDP. We are also very interested in this work with an extensive footprint on the ground, either in terms of country offices or country offices particularly engaged in conflict and fragile and peace and transition settings, with the joint programming that we do with peace and development advisors, with DPPA, for example, or others, and many, many important opportunities to move ahead. So just like you, we too are interested in the impact of prevention and peace building work, and how to sustain that at a global stage as well. I will stop my comments here and go to the colleagues, introducing them very quickly, but asking them a particular question that will base their response, and hopefully then we get to the point where we get some good questions and comments as well. The numbers are up to 120 participants. We may actually have to go to the chat box to have the kinds of questions that might come, and then share them with the participants. But again, remember, the chat box is open for comment and question for everyone to see. Our panelists, Olivia Russells from ACLED, our dear colleague Vasu from Accord, Adrienne from Search for Common Ground, and Darynell leading the Global Partnership for the Prevention of Armed Conflict, GPAC, will go in that order. Certainly hear about the work that they do, also in relation to the bigger question that we're answering today. But let me start with Olivia and ACLED. And I know that they've been participating in a number of events also here in the Stockholm Forum, but in a number of other initiatives that we do. For ACLED, we have agreed that the thrust of the engagement would basically look at a couple of things. Research and policy making often is related to how much data you have and how you can use it, not just about how to collect it. And we know, broadly speaking, that data quality and collection is an issue in fragile conflict affected settings, and even in just normal settings where developmentally and institutionally the countries are not as developed. So there's the quality and the time and appropriateness and how to use that for decision making for peace and prevention. A couple of quick questions for Olivia. How can we improve quantitative and qualitative data collection and analysis techniques for rich case and cross case analysis, since you have quite a broad frame of what you collect and how you analyze it? Let me also ask a second question, so you might be able to take those together. Peace building is a process, and it takes time and persistent work and build strength. How can we use this long-term data perspective to measure continually and adapt and adjust our peace building efforts? Olivia, over to you.
And thank you to the Stockholm Forum for organizing this, and UNDP for facilitating. Really happy to be here. So I'll maybe just start a very brief background of ACLED. So ACLED is a nonprofit, for those of you who aren't familiar, and we collect data on political violence and protest in real time and with near global coverage. So we're an events-based data set, which I explained to those who don't often use conflict data, is essentially a list of incidents of political violence with information about the actors involved, when and where it took place, and the type of incident. So just kind of with a bit of background on what ACLED does, I myself have a background in peace building, both in programming and DM&E. So I think about these questions both from ACLED's perspective in producing the data, as well as from the programming, through the programming lens. So starting with the second question, really, I've been thinking about this throughout my career, both with ACLED and in the field. And I think it's very clear that these kind of longer-term data analysis allows you to understand changes in conflict dynamics more generally. But I think most importantly, what it does is it allows you to break outside of the confines of the project cycle, both kind of temporally as well as spatially. So to kind of look at things outside of your normal cycle of the project or programs. So it allows you to really understand patterns over a longer period of time. So where are there cycles of violence and what that looks like. Identify risks and opportunities nearby. So are there spikes in violence in neighboring provinces that could threaten to diffuse into your area of implementation and create challenges? And it allows you to see that. And then I think touching on the impact component that Samuel mentioned, it also allows you to see post-end-line impact. So obviously, and as the question suggests, peacebuilding takes a really long time, and we don't often see results and impact within the project cycle. We see it long time afterwards. And so kind of keeping that in mind as well in terms of how these data, these analysis can really capture that. I wanted to give an example from some analysis that ACLED actually published just a couple of days ago on the Burundian election. This is close to my heart. I live in Burundi for half of the year usually. And the analysis, and there was also an election yesterday, important to mention, the analysis looked at this in the context of the upcoming election, comparing the 2015 election cycle to the 2020 election cycle, and trying to understand what had changed to inform activities. So violence, unsurprisingly, did take place in both election cycles and kind of is still taking place. But whereas in 2015, it was largely concentrated within Bujumbura and urban areas and targeting protesters, in 2020, so far, it's been very dispersed across the country and targeting the main opposition party. So these kind of analysis really have allowed us to look at the longer term and understand how things have changed fundamentally over time. And with that information from analysis like this, you can then apply that to your programming, different target groups, different locations, and things like that. And taking the other question in terms of quality of data and kind of thinking how can we improve the quality and also allow for this really cross-case rich analysis that we're looking for. I think what's most important is that high quality data and analysis really start with the right sources. So what sources are you using? And at ACLED, we place a premium on local data sources. So for us, often this means local conflict observatories. And international sources and media tend to be very urban-centric or focused on kind of these large, significant events, incidents of terrorism and newsworthy events, unfortunately, we can say. Whereas local sources kind of counter this or sidestep it in terms of the biases. And so it's important to improve data collection and analysis. These local sources and observatories especially, they really need support. And they need two types of support. This is how we think about it at ACLED. On the technical side, in terms of improving the data collection and analysis, data management, and all of those aspects, because often these groups are not necessarily people who have a background in data collection or kind of bring that technical background. They're human rights defenders, they're journalists, and people who have kind of gotten involved in monitoring the situation because they're passionate or they're peace builders, local peace builders. And so we need to support them technically to create data that is then useful in the broader context. And also I should mention financially as well in terms of ensuring their sustainability. I think this is something that myself and maybe for those who've worked in this space as well, I've seen repeatedly for every conflict observatory that's producing incredible data and analysis locally, there's also many others who have started and then stopped or emerged and disappeared just to cover a particular election cycle or crisis. And we really need to support the longevity of these organizations. And I think that's really important. And where these kinds of groups don't exist, I think, or have kind of become defunct or not as active, we need to support them to kind of reinvigorate the activities. ACLED's been doing this, for example, in Cabo Delgado in Mozambique, where there was kind of an unofficial network of local reporters and people providing local data, but we need to support them with infrastructure in order to make sure that that data actually reaches out into the broader peace building community. Each of these groups really have a very specific different methodology based on their context and what they're doing, and it's really responsive to the local context. So some would be monitoring airstrikes in Yemen, others might be looking at drug-related violence in the Philippines, and kind of everything in between. And I think it's really important to kind of preserve this unique contribution because they're coming out of a conflict context and responding to what's needed on the ground. And so this really means from kind of a global perspective or organizations that are working outside of these areas, not imposing methodologies and priorities on these groups, but rather kind of working with them in partnership and collaboration and using these local data and translating and integrating them into global data sets like ACLED or others. And that really, the kind of harnessing of this really rich local data and not changing their methodology, but integrating it into broader data sets, that's what can facilitate this really rich cross-case analysis and comparative analysis. And perhaps I'll leave it at there. I know we're tight on time, so.
Thank you very much, Olivia. Very clear. I think it's a good segue to Vasu as well. I think the data, local usefulness, quantity to analysis, making use of it, and then this vertical integration of data from using local or bringing local data to have a broader perspective on what it says about conflict in broad settings, I think is important. Vasu, next in 2022, Accord will be 30 years old, if I understand that correctly. And you've certainly seen the longitudinal perspective on accompanying, seeing peacebuilding processes as they move ahead, with some relapses perhaps in the middle. But from your sense, the quality of engagement and the analysis of that, and monitoring and being able to adapt and step in as peacebuilding organizations, how do you see that from the perspective of Accord, from this long history in engaging in peacebuilding in Africa, but globally certainly as well?
Yeah, thank you very much, Samuel, and thank you for arranging this also. I mean, I think we're at an interesting juncture globally where questions like this become extremely important and extremely timely, because we are going to see an upsurge of social and political unrest across the world to different degrees. And I think it will become important now for us as peace builders to begin to understand, how do we measure what is actually what we might consider peace, and in that context, how do we also measure what indicators, measure indicators that can give us a sense of impending conflict. And this, I think, will be important today. So I was listening to Olivia, I think, with ACLED, and Olivia, you guys do a great job with ACLED. We're all using ACLED data also, but I know it's not easy. We have just started our own conflict and resilience monitor. Many of you might have seen it. We've just yesterday published the 5th issue of the monitor. So what we're doing is basically looking at 7 conflict indicators on the continent, and I don't want to go through all of the indicators. So basically, it's like stigmatization and discrimination, trust between state and institutions, or rather the public and institutions. So these are the kind of indicators that we're looking at, and of course we are then putting that into an instrument, analyzing that, and then producing analysis out of that. Of course, the end product is to ensure that you can engage on the ground using that analysis as early warning, and then developing strategies to do that. So I think this is possible, and I think it's necessary also, because we have to improve the quality of our interventions on the ground. And so we have now these modern instruments for doing that. And in terms of the technology that is available, you can do all kinds of analysis using that technology. But I think Olivia is correct that it depends. It's not about the quantity of information. There's a lot of quantity of information. It then comes to the quality of information. And as peace builders, as institutions involved in this, we have a responsibility to make sure that there is clear verification of the information that we're using, so that in the do no harm principle, we should ensure that information, because today there's so much of fake news that is out there, and people can craft fake news using technology that makes it look very real. And particularly in the field that we are in conflict, we have seen now, people can take incidents from one country, make it look like it's in another country. They can take incidents that are 10 years ago, craft it and make it look like it's a recent incident. So I think when it comes to data collection and how we deal with data collection, we have to be very careful. Now let me switch to the real experiences on the ground in terms of what then can we use to measure peace. And I think we have to look, if we're looking at post-conflict countries, because the relapse in a lot of the cases come from conflicts that have been resolved, peace agreements have been reached, and then you have a post-conflict situation, and 5 years later you have a relapse into conflict. And I think there are two things that you're looking for. The first is, and I want to use my own country as an example, because we came through a very deeply divided society, racially divided society, and we were close to a civil war in 1993. We had the right wing in our country training about 50,000 non-statutory armed groups, and on the other side about 20,000-30,000 being trained. And then we had proliferation of conflicts across the country. Many people, I think, looking at South Africa today don't realize that on the eve of our election and on election day, there was a bomb at Johannesburg airport that exploded. Downtown Johannesburg, there were a number of bombs that were set off on the eves of the election. So this means, we were really edging close to a civil war. So what were we looking for after that to say that we have peace in the country? And if you look at the late President Mandela's focus in the first 5 years, which was his presidency, the focus was on social cohesion. So I think the first indicator is societal relations. And it's about social cohesion. So what are you looking for? You're looking for relations between political parties. You're looking for relations between society and the state. You're looking at relations within society. And what is the resilience of a society to be able to build and sustain social cohesion? So I think this is something, and this is something that doesn't end. So there's, it's a process, because even today, we are measuring, and I've sat on a commission looking at social cohesion in the province that I come from, which is KwaZulu-Natal, where we've had one of the most, the highest levels of violence during our struggle here. We lost around 20,000 people in a span of 5 or 6 years in violent conflict on the ground. And after 20 years, the premier, who's sort of the governor of this province, set up a commission, and there were about 5 of us who sat on the commission to look at social cohesion 20 years later, and to see whether it had improved, whether it had not improved, and what were the challenges to social cohesion. So I think the first is immediately trying to understand this question of social cohesion, how to measure it, and then tracking it all through the period so that you can see whether the society is becoming more vulnerable or not. The second thing then in the long term is about the transformation of institutions and the robustness of institutions. So if you look at the state, for example, you are looking at whether you have a separation of powers, because a separation of powers is a cornerstone of a democratic society. Do you have a legislature that is independent enough, a legislature that is making laws, and that these laws are then administered by an administration which is separate from the legislature, and then you have an independent judiciary that has oversight over the administration and the implementation of those laws. If there is a weakness in that system, then you know that that society does not have a complete peace, and that kind of fragility can lead to conflict. The second then is the institutions that govern relations with society, the media, whether the institutions that govern association, movement of people, mobility of people, and speech, free speech of people. And you're looking for the media, you're looking for civil society, and the robustness of all of these institutions. So maybe just to end, is to say in the short term, you're looking at social cohesion. In the long term, you're looking at the robustness of institutions. And these two things together will indicate whether you will have a sustainable peace or whether this is a country that will relapse back into peace. Thanks, Samuel.
Thank you very much. That's very clear. Plug that just a few weeks ago completed and aligned our social cohesion guidance that we've been working on for a year now. So that's, but I also want to reinforce, which is related to social cohesion, vertical sense, social contract, where that is now of the protest movements we've been seeing. The same time with the
Samuel, you're breaking up on my side. I'm not sure if it's only me or whether it's everybody else.
No, it's the time of the day.
I see everybody shaking their head, so it's probably everybody who's hearing you breaking up.
Sam, you might want to put off your camera.
Yeah, I did. Thank you for reminding me of the vertical social contract stuff that I think is really quite important, Vasu, as well as the horizontal relationships in terms of communities, capital, etc. Because I think those two links are really important in thinking of prevention and building opportunity to do something that is both centric and people-centric or at the same time. We'll come two quick things. I mentioned comments and questions in the chat. They're not actually, they're in the Q&A box. So even for, please go to that. I think we're already getting some good ones. And then moving also very quickly, lose question altogether. A lot of people remember I think it's the 2000 Mining for Results manual, a search look towards some of those chapters, looking at impact and measurement. And Search for Common Ground has been working on a lot of prevention and peace building initiatives in many countries around a long time, focus on learning and measure. So Adrienne, you get the difficult question. How do we know that it is impactful if we actually prevent it? How do we measure what we didn't see or what didn't materialize? And how do we actually measure things that we haven't done harm or actually left build a lasting footprint in a particular context or particular group? Over.
Okay, thanks, Samuel. So I'll just repeat the question so everyone can hear, because you did break up a little bit. And the two questions are, how are we measuring impact in order to understand whether we're averting the outbreak of violent conflict, given the challenge of demonstrating that a given action resulted in conflict not taking place? And then the second question being about how do we look at impact assessment, not only whether we do harm, or this principle of do no harm, but also leaving a peacebuilding footprint. So it's been a really interesting evolution at Search, given the diversity of our programs, and getting at this question of impact and how we measure it and how you do that as an organization has been a years-long process of us trying to decide and name what are the key aspects that are most important for us and also for our teams. I saw a question in the Q&A that was about the kind of practicalities of decision making on the ground, and that's, these elements are all things that we were taking into consideration in addition to what are the right things to measure. And we actually came up with sort of 5 core elements that have guided our strategy for how we want to look at impact. The first is that it really needs to be grounded in the realities, grounded in the realities of people's experiences living in conflict. So Olivia's point about making sure that we're taking knowledge from people who have this knowledge and are experiencing quite a lot and have a lot to share, and making sure that we're bringing that into our thinking at a broader level rather than trying to impose something. It also needs to be collected across, be able to be collected across borders for that to work for our teams. We often work with groups that are perhaps migrating, between South Sudan and Uganda, and then back to South Sudan a few months later, across the Syria and Lebanon border, right? So having the ability to understand conflict, but not in a way that's simply kind of stuck around us, a specific border, is really important to us. And especially thinking about how conflict may evolve as online space is, used more and more and plays a role in conflict. And then we have 3 principles, and this is where I thought it was really interesting hearing Vasu talk about vertical relationships and horizontal relationships, because that's one of ours. This question about institutions needs to really be there. It needs to be present in what we're looking at. The question about social norms and how do you understand how conflict is accepted or expected in certain ways. And then last, how is conflict resourced, and how is peace resourced? So what are the opportunities that we have there to look at the level of sustainability of some of our efforts? So this all went into a lot of the thinking behind our current framework for understanding conflict. And I have a couple of lessons that we've learned from this process. The first is collect less data. We collect a lot of data, and a lot of it is for accountability, which is super important. But the question of understanding impact often needs to be narrowed so that you can identify whether you're really having the impact. You know, when you start to ask too many questions, it becomes really difficult to actually analyze that data, and really difficult for teams to know what to do with it. So first was collect less. We're working more and more to use, data sets like ACLEDS or ACCORD, when these things are published, actually using them in our own analysis rather than trying to go out and recollect that data. So that's the first. The second is focusing data on specific things that really speak to our impact. It's very easy to start also looking then at, okay, well, how are we looking at this trend or that trend, and different trends that maybe our program hasn't actually shifted. And we do that for a whole host of reasons, right? There are lots of kind of expectations and I think, sort of outside influences of what might be the right things to measure. So the goal that the process that we've gone through is really narrowing that down and figuring out what are the most essential things that any peace builder on our teams will be doing and expecting to impact in some way. And then third is using comparative analysis to really collect data and look at the differences. So a very quick example is Sierra Leone. We did a randomized control trial that looked very specifically at the value of open debates. And we were able to show that through debates, we actually saw a difference in political participation. In a way that it made it very clear for us. Okay, these are the clear lessons of what quality programming around elections can encourage, and what we could kind of strive for in future programs. So really trying to set us up to have those conversations. And around the do no harm aspect, I think it's a very interesting question. How do you move from just do no harm to actually setting the footprints for future peace building? We've done this in two ways. One is participatory research. It's a really core element at Search that much of our research actually is not led by Search staff, but also includes or is led by participants in our programs and people in the communities where we work. And what that allows us to do is actually shift the kind of power balance between groups who might not normally get to be part of the conversation, and actually makes them the people who are listened to. So, so that's one tool that I think has been very effective. And the other is taking this whole, all of the data that we're collecting and actually using it with rigorous reflection. So we've done that, really instilled this culture of reflection at Search, where every quarter, every 6 months, we're looking at this data and trying to figure out, well, what has happened? What's changed? What do we need to be responding to? And particularly around quickly changing dynamics, it's very useful to be able to have that culture there and have the kind of spirit of open debate.
Very much. As predicted, my internet is going in and out again, but I'm back. I think a couple of quick things. A heads up to the colleagues as well. If you're looking at some of the questions that are coming up in the Q&A, I think they're for Olivia. Perhaps Vasu, you can also look at the ones related to the politics, but to measure as well. And as we look forward to the other questions, we'll be looking at them and seeing how to respond to them. When we're talking about who, and I think you mentioned this, as we partner with colleagues in the field, are we working with to collect and make use of data? Monica, if not, please. I'll introduce Darynell here from a long experience and a network of civil society organizations. Very value this as well. One of the things that we didn't talk about this morning yet are particular of the populations that focus as peace builders working on conflict prevention, youth particularly, women particularly. How do you see in the broad global
Sam, we can't hear you at all. Sam?
Sam, we didn't hear the question at all.
But maybe I will repeat here. Darynell, if we want to ensure that no one is left behind, and we have been, talking about an inclusive data, we need to adopt methodologies and approaches that are inclusive. They inform constructive learning processes. They bring in young people. They bring in women. They bring in, and then they highlight the whole YPS and the WPS agenda, right? So Darynell, as the executive director of GPAC, what we would like to hear your reflections on the focus areas of youth empowerment. How can we increase not only the presence, but the influence of marginalized and vulnerable populations in monitoring, evaluation, data collection, and also on the downward accountability mechanisms. Over to you, Darynell.
Okay, thanks a lot. First of all, thank you for the invitation to this discussion. I think it's very important because, as the Irish mathematician said, William Thomson said, to measure is to know. So we have to see what it is that we want to know in order to know what we want to measure. And when we apply that role to peace building, I think that we have to be aware that what we want to measure is change. But what kind of change? It is often personal change, change in perceptions on how people are perceiving their own security, change on safety perceptions, change on perceptions on whether people feel that they can have a life project in the future and where they can develop their potential, change on how they see their interpersonal relations, and also their relations, as Vasu was saying, not only among people, but also among people and the institutions that govern them. So when we're talking about this, I think I'm a big advocate of the concept of human security, because I think it brings a lot into asking that question of what is that we need to change, and then monitoring whether this change is taking place or not. I want to share two examples, or to illustrate these points with two examples of some projects that we're working on in GPAC, one in Colombia and another one in Kyrgyzstan. So in Colombia, after the signing of the peace agreement, we've been working with some civil society organizations there who wanted to organize what they call intergenerational dialogues for peace, bringing in small towns very much affected by violence over the past 50 years, this opportunity to bring the perspectives of young, not so young people, older generations, in the spirit that peace building is something that transcends the lifetime of one person. It's an intergenerational thing. And after a 60-year conflict in Colombia, it will take probably several generations to build peace. So with that in mind, we organized these small world cafes in different small towns. About a year after that, and about a year after the signing of the peace agreement, we brought together some of those people from the different communities and asked them, okay, it's been a year since the peace agreement with the FARC has been signed. Have you noticed any change in your life? And some they say, yes, of course, absolutely. We noticed some changes. For example, it's like, well, let me give you the example. In my town, for many years, 10, 15, maybe more, the 8 p.m. mass, going to church at 8 p.m., that was canceled. Nobody was able to go to mass at that time. because it was too dangerous to go. Now, 1 year after the signing of the agreement, we have our 8 p.m. mass back in the town. And it's the most successful, it's the social event in the town. It's what everybody looks forward every weekend to go there because that's where we socialize, etc. To you, that may seem as a small thing, but to us, that's huge. That's what it is. We also see some of our friends of mine who had to go to the city, to the capital to look for work or who were displaced by violence. We see some of them coming back because they think that now their life project, they actually have better chances to be realized here, working in the land, etc. So we also see that small changes. So that's one story of those small changes at the community level. Second story I wanted to share is about a project that we're having in Kyrgyzstan with the support of the UN Peacebuilding Fund, actually, called Cameras in Hand, Empowering Youth Perspectives. What we intended to do was to use this participatory video methodology as a way of bringing together young people who were in different sides of an ethnic divide in the Fergana Valley. So that was the main aim. That was achieved to a great extent. It was a very successful project. The idea is to help them or to teach them how to make videos, how to make movies, really, more than videos. And in the process, that is the excuse. In the reality is that in the process, they are able to challenge perceptions that they have among themselves, etc. So while that was the main goal of the project, what we also found after the project, or during the execution of the project, is that when we started with that, we asked them to say, what do you want to make your movie about? And we thought a lot of the things were going to be about interethnic tensions, violence against them, etc. And what we found out is that many of the topics that these young people felt that really affected them, and what they really wanted to communicate with these movies, were much more simpler things. And one of the issues that recurrently came, for example, was youth marriage. The pressure that they had to get married at a very young age. So I was talking to some girls, 16-year-old, and some boys, 17, 18-year-old. And the girls were saying, it's like, I'm 16, and in less than 2 years, I'm expected to be married already and probably to have a child already. And that is a very difficult thing for me to speak to my parents or in my community. And that is what is really making me anxious. And same thing, the guys were saying, like, yeah, I'm 17 and I'm supposed to be head of a family and I'm supposed to leave school. I cannot go to university. I'm not going to be able to develop my life project as I want. And I'm not even able to speak about that because it's a given. It's something that you have to do in your life. And those kind of stories was what caught my attention because I thought this methodology was very useful, not only to build the divide among divided communities, but to actually, as a mean of articulating human security concerns of young people and really be able to communicate them. So where do I want to get at? Essentially, that when we think about the impact of our peace-building interventions and we want to see and assess how effective they have been, first of all, we should go at the local level, see really what small changes are we having almost at the individual level. How are people's individual perceptions of their security, of their changing, and how those are community perceptions changing. And that is something that we have to really look. We'll go into, along with the big numbers, with the big matrix, with the big indicators, go into the smaller stories of people and see what is changing for you. Kind of like what Adrienne was mentioning about having a participatory approach to monitoring and evaluation. Of course, that is easier said than done. That is a very labor-intensive process, but I think it's a worthwhile process because it does tell us how people feel their conditions are changing. The second point, I think as peace builders, sometimes we disregard or we're not aware of these very strong structural, hierarchical pressures that young people, in this case, are faced with, and that they feel very hard to challenge. And when we plan peace-building interventions, without that perspective, often we lack the ownership of the young people, the interest on the understanding of what we're trying to do by young people, and we basically lose them. And by losing them, we're losing the sustainability of the intervention because our work is not something that's going to happen in 1 to 5, 10 years. It's something that has to be seen with a long-term perspective. And if we lose that perspective, the young people, we will lose a lot of our effectiveness. So it is critical then that we, at the beginning, when we are starting to think about the interventions, what is the change that we want to achieve? Think of ways of how we can circumvent these structural mechanisms that put some pressure or that don't allow those voices to come out explicitly and be able to help shape the intervention and hence help us monitor how the change that they want to see is taking place or not. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Darynell. I hope I'm back and you can hear me, at least for now. Just looking through some of the questions, I'll try to hand those over, as a good moderator would do, to a number of colleagues to answer, and picking up on some of them as well. A number of questions came to Olivia about data, and I hope she can take those as well. And I think one of those, Olivia, that I think is important too, since you have a broad sense of where the data is coming from, that can basically go beyond national borders. The question on boundary disputes, cross-border disputes, especially when you may have a middle-income country that appears stable, but its neighbors are really tough neighbors. And in that sense, how to look at different data sets, different capacities, different abilities to measure, and maybe where some of those areas are looking, you might be looking at as well. I think maybe I'll ask Vasu to look at political positioning and peace building, also the source and politics of data collection, if indeed part of what you use and look at comes from official sources. And I think this complements very well what Olivia has been mentioning as well. Search for common ground, I know they do quite a bit, also related to what Darynell mentioned and some of the stories that are being collected. On the qualitative work, the stories, the videos, the people experiences, do we always think of these as anecdotal, complementary, etc., as to hard data, to quantitative work, or how do you use that work to actually either measure impact, sustainability, or as Darynell, I think, started in the beginning of his presentation, people's lives become changed because of an intervention, and that is a sustainable process as well. I'd like all of us, I think, to also reflect on a question from Gustavo. Maybe we can go back to Darynell for this as well, on the relationship between data and risks. So is it the more that you know, especially vis-a-vis donors, partners, etc., the more that you know makes you more risk aware, able to engage more, or more risk averse? I think Gustavo is saying that perhaps the risk aversion and prevention and peace building continues to be exacerbated and gets worse, but maybe there is an argument to be made that knowing more makes you able to take more measured risks and mitigate them, and at the same time look for opportunities where they might not have existed before. So thanks for that question as well. Let me stop here. We can go to you very quickly as I look at some other questions and come back. Let's start with Olivia.
Great, thank you. Appreciate those kind of bits that you evoked from the various questions. I was reading through them, and I think kind of a unifying piece to this is how do we access and cover information in places that are difficult to reach? So I saw a question about kind of places where the area is controlled by military. You mentioned kind of covering boundaries, so between areas, to capture the full picture, because conflict doesn't stop at the border, and there's a lot of dynamics regionally and between countries. So kind of how ACLED approaches this is our core goal with our data collection is always to reflect the reality on the ground. So that, of course, does necessitate understanding things that pass across borders and into areas that are challenging to access. And so in terms of our sourcing methodology, we like to make sure that we do start with media and international media in terms of one of our sources, but we move far beyond that. And the conflict observatories that I mentioned in local sources is really the key piece of this. So I appreciate the questions in terms of it connecting to that. And maybe I'll just take the example that I brought up in my presentation around Mozambique, that we had been realizing this with regards to Mozambique and working with our coverage, that there were areas, particularly Cabo Delgado, that we've been focusing on, where it's extremely challenging to access information, and traditional media just simply doesn't capture the realities on the ground. And so what we advocate for, and I think what a lot of the partners here on the panel would probably say the same, is really investing in those local voices and kind of getting that information from the ground up. And so that's investing in things like conflict observatories. So that's really how ACLED approaches it. To mention some of the kind of boundary areas in terms of places like Syria and Iraq, and kind of understanding dynamics around violence there, where since the beginning of the conflict in Syria, or very shortly thereafter, it was challenging to understand what was happening, because from a bird's eye view of international media, you just don't understand what really is taking place. And so it's absolutely critical to work with consortia of local organizations that have these data. These data exist, and there's a lot of people that are monitoring these situations on the ground, and it's extremely important that we turn to them and work with them and try to elevate those data to global accessibility. Maybe I'll pause there. I know we don't have a ton of time, and I want to give my co-panelists a chance to speak.
Thank you very much. Vasu, can we go to you, and then we go to Adrienne and Darynell after that, and maybe I'll plug in another question too. Vasu, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Samuel. So let me, I think the question was asked by Hayek on peace building is often considered as political positioning that contradicts the national interest. I don't think they are mutually exclusive. I think, if you see it in oppositional terms, then it becomes mutually exclusive. And if I think sometimes also not unjustified, sometimes it's also seen in conspiratorial terms about whether people are accessing information for purposes that might contradict the national interest. I think generally, peace building should be an activity that strengthens the national, should be in the national interest to strengthen the nation, not to strengthen the state, but to strengthen the nation and to build social cohesion, and to ensure when we talk about positive peace, we are talking about social justice. And social justice has to be in the interest of the nation. So I don't think that these two things are mutually exclusive. However, when then we come to the issue of using official statistics or using official pronouncements, whether there's a media statements by the state, etc., does that create a bias in the analysis that we have if we rely only on that? Now, that there is a danger in that. I think if we look at information and what we were talking about, both myself and Olivia earlier on, there has to be verification of that information. So I think relying only on one source is a problem and will create a bias. So I think we have to be very careful about, especially when we're dealing with data and information. Anum, I think, asked the question about anecdotal evidence related to, I think it was religion, and how is it possible to incorporate this into data sets. I think, again, anecdotal evidence. Anecdotal evidence is what it is. It's anecdotal, and it might be sometimes in itself a bias. It might also be secondary information. And Darynell, I think what you guys are doing by the videos of testimonies, etc., is very, very useful, because these are people's stories about what is actually happening. How we factor that into data sets, I think, is a matter of ensuring that we verify again what the story is, because people can, of course, also give you anecdotes that might be exaggerated, etc. So again, it's about verification, because we want to ensure that we have really good information. Good information will give you good analysis. Good analysis will give you good strategies. If you don't have that trajectory, you will not be able to intervene effectively. And then maybe just to come to very quickly, Gustavo's question. Gustavo is a former colleague from Accord. So Gustavo, it's nice to know that you're online. And Gustavo, you know that I'm a lawyer. And, you know, lawyers deal with evidence. And it's always good to say, you know, lawyers always say, forearmed is forewarned. And I think it's always better to have information. And yes, sometimes it can make you risk averse. You know, when you live in a society and you know too much about what is happening, sometimes that does make you risk averse. And I think, yes, very often, for whatever reason, partners, donors, countries, etc., even peace builders who are interveners, tend to be risk averse when it comes to dealing with that. And I think rather we should see it as how this can arm you, how this can empower you, in fact, to be more effective. And again, it must be done in the interest of the nation, meaning social justice and for all the people of the country.
Thank you very much, Vasu. A couple of quick things. George Wachira, the theory of change question is a good segue to Adrienne, because I still think one of the simplest and best short chapters on theory of change is in Search for Common Grounds, Designing for Results, Chapter 2, if you're still checking. And Aaron, thank you very much for that quick question on conflict, unrest, violence caused by COVID, or made more grave, apparent by COVID. And I think there's a lot of analysis that has come out recently in the last couple of months on the relationship between conflict, violence, fragility, and COVID, whether it's at the institutional level and how institutions cope or manipulate to close up previously open space, shut down freedom, voice, etc., or they're just unable to respond. And then at the social level, obviously things related to xenophobia, hate speech, whatever that appears certainly online in terms of using the media for vilifying or demonizing particular segments of the populations. But I think that's also a really good question. Adrienne, over to you, and then I think maybe we'll close after that with Darynell.
Thanks. Yeah, so I just to kind of go off of what Vasu was saying about the value of qualitative data. I mean, when we're looking at when you're looking at, have you created the change that you intended, or have you impacted a conflict? Have you transformed a conflict in the way that you're expecting? It's not just a yes or no answer. It's about this question of how did this piece that we did influence that, and then how, when those two things changed, did that change this other element, right? These are complex ecosystems where an economic shift is also going to impact governance elements, and something like coronavirus is going to have an impact on how people perceive their ability to relate to their governments and even to each other. And so we have to look at those things together. For me, the value of qualitative data in that is it helps you understand the why. It helps you understand the things that you haven't sort of pre-thought out. And that's really important, because we're not going to perfectly think everything out in advance. So giving yourself the ability to maintain quality data collection, quality understanding of your impact, it is partly qualitative. That's a super important pillar for us at Search. I don't think we can just kind of throw that out. But these things, they work with quantitative data. We have to kind of look at them as two types of information that can really inform each other and support each other. And the other thing that I'll say about that is they don't have to be, qualitative data doesn't have to be anecdotal. You can also systematically analyze qualitative data to understand patterns, to look at what's happening in a way that's useful. I'll leave it there so that Darynell can have the last word.
Thank you very much. Darynell, over to you.
Thank you. Right, nice having the last word. Yeah, going back to the question about risk and the engagement in peace building. I think we have to see it also from the perspective of donors and countries that support our work. And they are often under extreme political pressure to show results, no? And they translate that pressure to us. We have to show results, and then they work under very short time frames. We have the legislature, we have to show the impact of the money that we're giving you. We need to make our case towards Parliament because we need to approve our budgets. So they often tell us, help you by showing, really fleshing out stories of how your work is effective. And I think that's the challenge in the work as peace building that takes no years, no decades, but sometimes even generations to show those kind of quick impact results that are often needed to justify the investment in the work that we do. Some ways to perhaps mitigate that or to contribute to that crave for results is precisely to look at small changes, to try to monitor small changes and to frame those small changes in the bigger picture and show why that small change is significant in the long run. No? And I think we need to do a better job at that. I like for example, the everyday life, everyday peace indicators, I think they're called, which look kind of like the example I was giving with the church, with going to church. You know, it's like it goes into the community and it's like, really tell us what is the change that you want to see in your community at the really community level, and then see we can monitor that small change and how that small change fits into the bigger picture we want to achieve. So I think that is an important. And I want to close maybe with the importance of storytelling in our work, because monitoring and evaluation can not only be a mechanism of accountability, of helping us plan interventions, but really also a mechanism to showcase the importance of our work, to convince people about the importance of peace building. And anecdotal stories, which are not necessarily anecdotal, but like Adrienne was saying, really bring a lot of information systematically. They help to convey that importance. And if we manage to be good storytellers, bringing those stories of change and communicating better to those who can help us do our work, I think we'll go a long way. You know? Like, because as Maya Angelou said, people will not remember what you said, people will not remember what you told them, people will not remember what you did, they will remember how you made them feel. So if we are able to make people feel the importance of our work through stories, through emotions, we will be able to use our data to make a big contribution to continue doing our work and to further the peace building field.
Thank you very much, Darynell. Excellent closing words. Just to let Rafael know that I haven't forgotten that question, a tough one on Somalia. And I think this is where the politics and the data and the state building work and the engagement of donors and local peace builders all come together. That's probably for another webinar or session, but likely for a book. Ole, thank you very much for the question. I hope Darynell answered part of that in relation to how to talk to partners and donors about the usefulness of data, how to de-risk some of this work and offer more opportunity, especially in very short times. When projects and donor funding is 1 year to 18 months, I think it's really tough to get results, but I think there are ways at least to show the difference in people's lives in the work that we do. We've noted all questions and we'll make sure that they are responded to. The very simple response, if you haven't received the very simple issue, if you haven't received a response in this session, is to please be in touch with us individually and collectively, and we'll take that forward, because some experiences already exist, guidance notes already exist, lessons learned already exist, and we're happy to respond, obviously. Colleagues, thank you very much, all of our presenters, and to the 150 nearly participants that joined. We really appreciated this, and certainly to the Stockholm Forum colleagues and the organizers for giving us this opportunity. Looking forward to the next time. Over.
Thanks.
Thank you.